Hi, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I have my July wrap-up. I'm going to attempt to do this in one video, so I'm going to try to talk really quickly through all the books that I read this month because I read a lot. I am helped by the fact that a lot of these books were for my SEASL project, so because I talked way more in depth on those books in those videos, not going to talk in depth here. So we have Legendborn. This is one of my top books for SEASL this year, as you saw in that video. In Legendborn, you have a girl who's grieving the loss of her mother, and she goes off to an early college program, gets involved in Arthurian legend and magic, and there's actually not competing magic systems, but magic systems that are very closely related, but they're different, and they look at each other quite differently. So it's really good. I believe I rated this 4.5 stars, if not a very high 4 stars. Next we have Dress Coded. In this book, one of the characters takes up sort of an activist campaign about the dress code at their local middle school when she sees that things are being applied unfairly to her friends. I love it. There's a bit of mixed media with the podcast elements and some texts. It's absolutely fantastic. This was a 4-star read. Next we have Santiago's Road Home. This is the third book that I have read from Alexandra Diaz. It, I believe, in my opinion, is the second of the 3. It is better than the sequel to the first book that I read from her, that I read earlier this year. But I think it hasn't captured the same wow factor that I had with the first book from her. But in this, she highlights the travesty of the family separation policy that the previous administration put in place. I ended up rating this book 3.5 stars. Next we have Cleo Porter and the Body Electric by Jake Burt. He did suffer a little bit, in my opinion, I think, just because of the timing with, a real life pandemic. He wrote this, although made some edits during lockdown, but he wrote this before the pandemic. In this, there is a pandemic that has made everybody completely isolate, shut off from absolutely everything. And Cleo has to leave her apartment for the first time in her entire life to return this medicine that was misdelivered to somebody who absolutely needs it. I rated this 4 stars. Next, we have Watch Over Me by Nina LaCour. I really wanted to absolutely love this book. There was so much about the actual writing itself that I loved. There were just some things that I can't really put a finger on that kept me from really loving this book and rating it really highly. This girl is dealing with some really intense trauma, and she goes to this isolated farm instead of college, and she works through that trauma and has a found family as part of it. All of those seem like winners in my book, but I ended up rating it 3.5 stars. Last of the SEASL books, we have Lycanthropy and Other Chronic Illnesses. This I thought was absolutely fantastic. The representation for chronic illnesses is amazing. And I've had some people say, well, I have X disease and it doesn't play out like this. I know people with that disease where it did play out like it was in the book. And that's the thing with chronic illnesses. They play out so individually, which is why there's such a stigma against them. This did fall a little bit short in the fantastical part of it with the lycanthropy, not in the build up to it and the initial discovery and Priya trying to help her friend, but in how it was resolved. And for that reason, I rated it a very high 3.5 stars or a low 4 star. As part of the SEASL project, we also have Displacement. When I talked about this in the SASL project, it was really disappointing because it was so pedantic, so teaching, and it didn't really tell the story. It just wanted to teach a lesson. I enjoyed the art style, but overall, it ended up disappointing, and I believe I rated this 2.5 stars. Also in the young adult category, we have Prepped. At first, I was really thankful that it didn't go down there are doomsday preppers and, oh, it's an actual apocalypse. I was so glad it didn't go into the actual apocalypse thing. And it really started having these characters grapple with what does it mean when people start really going off the deep end with this whole ideology. But then there was just an utter lack of an ending that was just terrible. So this was my second to least favorite book of the young adult list, and I rated it 2.5 stars. We also have the Inheritance Games for the young adults list. I've been wanting to read this for a while. It's pretty popular in the genre. I thought it was a feel-good, mystery, engaging read, the rich people drama that people like, even though the main character is not rich, but like all the other characters are super rich. Fun mystery, nothing groundbreaking. I rated this 3 stars. Also, for the young adult list, we have Cemetery Boys. This was an unexpected find. By reading this, I saw what so many people said about their disappointment in reading Lost in the Neverwoods, because there was just such an authenticity in Cemetery Boys from Aiden Thomas that you don't have in Lost in the Neverwoods. In this book, I found one of my all-time favorite characters in Julian. Just was fantastic. Great cultural representation. I rated this 4.5 stars. And then for the Junior Book Award, we have Amari and the Night Brothers. This was a reread, and I read this as audiobook. I don't know what was going on when I first read it and thought it was just average. There was so much that I picked up on my reread that I thought was absolutely fantastic and made so much more sense. And I'm like, why did I dog on this before? Now, is it an all-time favorite? No, but it bumped from a 3.5 stars to a 4.5 stars. Next, we have Fighting Words by Kimberly Brubaker Bradley. I knew this would be a hard-hitting book just based on the author alone. She did not hold back. And this, I believe, is the favorite of the ones that I read specifically for this project. This deals with a lot of childhood trauma, overcoming that, but also dealing with all of the things in there. This is an amazing book. I rated this 4.5 stars. And then we have the last 2 books that I read for this project. Unfortunately, I did not get to end on a high note. For the junior books, the last book that I read was The Stitchers by Lorian Lawrence. I was a little hesitant going into it because it compared it to Goosebumps, and I'm not much of a horror fan. The only one that I have read and really enjoyed is Small Spaces by Catherine Arden, and that one did creep me out a little bit. That's really as far as I'll go. This one did not creep me out at all. Nothing about it was really horrific or terrifying. It was so run-of-the-mill and average. 3 stars. Unfortunately, the last book that I read for the young adult list was also the worst, and that is All Your Twisted Secrets, which is basically like another copy of One of Us is Lying. It takes the trope of, let's get all these stereotypical high school characters together in a room. They've got secrets and they've treated each other poorly. It ends poorly. There's things going on. I had it figured out about 40% of the way through the book. None of the secrets were actually all that twisted. It was a real letdown, especially at the end. So that was a 2.5 stars. Next, I'm going to briefly talk about 4 Doctor Who graphic novel comic bind-ups that I read on the day of the latest Pokeathon gym to get all of those Pokemon. This was my least favorite. This actually was a compilation of really brief snippets from all of the previous Doctors, introducing the 13th Doctor, introducing Jodie's Doctor. And while I thought it was okay, the stories never developed because it was only like 2 or 3 pages worth for each Doctor. So it was fine, but definitely not my favorite. In Doctor Mania, we have the return of the Slitheen, and I thought this was a really compelling story, and I just love the dynamic of the 9th Doctor, Jack, and Rose. And in this one, you get Mickey coming in, but it's Mickey after he's met the 10th Doctor, David Tennant's Doctor, and he was actually trying to get that version of the Doctor, but he gets the wrong one. I mean, that's the Doctor Who trope. And you also have Martha, sort of, but obviously this Doctor does not know, Martha does not know the implications and things. He knows the Mickey that was head over heels for Rose. And then we have 10th Doctor, speaking of him, Breakfast at Tierney's. I honestly don't remember a lot of these stories. This is a follow-up to one that I have read previously where they were dealing with the Osirans, which is an alien race sort of modeled after Egyptian gods, and that one was really confusing. This one was not. It does have Anubis as one of the continuing characters in there from that storyline, so I do like that it's still building on it. I just don't remember a lot from this one. Then we have 11th Doctor. We have Serve You, and I really enjoyed this because it plays with the Doctor trope, and if he's actually going to confront, and then some of his companions like fighting against that. So I thought this one was pretty good. All of these, except for that first one, which I didn't enjoy. That one I rated 3 stars. These I rated 3.5 stars. They're not stellar and overwhelmingly great, but I love Doctor Who, so I love having these comics. Next, I'm going to briefly talk about these arcs that I read that are the part of the Manga Classics collection, and they've actually already been published, and I didn't realize that when I was first requesting it from NetGalley. Those were some of the ones that I automatically received, and I thought, I need to get my percentage on NetGalley up, so I'm going to read these. I thought that since I knew the stories, that they would be a really good introduction to manga and to see if I might want to try it out. I should have known that I would enjoy it, not certain types of manga. Obviously, you know that I don't like horror or whatever, but I have really enjoyed these interpretations and seeing the art develop and how it was interpreted. So some of them I liked a little bit less than others, but that's just because the base story I wasn't as into. So you see over here all of the different manga classics that I had the opportunity to read. My favorite of those was Les Miserables. Not because, well, partially because of the manga adaptation of it, but more so because Les Miserables is my absolute favorite classic. In the next segment, I'm going to talk about several arcs that I read. I forgot actually to put this on my updated goals, but I really want to get through my arcs on NetGalley and get that percentage up. And so when I was making my TBR for Questathon, I added a bunch of arcs, and so after finishing that, the books that I've been returning to were arcs, so I've actually gotten through a lot of them. So the first of those that I read for Questathon and in this month was The Merciless Ones by Namo, and it is the sequel to The Gilded Ones. I thought that this made the ending of The Gilded Ones make so much more sense. It's like it throws a bomb into the water and mushroom cloud of world expansion in this book. I'm not 100% sure if I'm on board for how Namo is expanding this world, but what she does is intense character development, and it's dark. It's not dark in the same way that The Gilded Ones was, but there's just a lot of like personal betrayal that's going in, people she thought she trusted when she found out about them just recently, and then realizing that she's been manipulated and how she's doing that and who she really is. It was really well done. I rated this one 4 stars. Next we have Children of Ragnarok by Cinda Williams Chima, and I really wanted to enjoy my read, and I thought this was a fantastic story and how it was based. There's not really a lot of problems that I can come up with because I loved the characters, I loved the world building, I loved the interactions, I loved how the characters developed. Just something was missing for me because it read so slowly. It was such a slog to get through. Now, yes, it's a long book, but I read long books that aren't necessarily a slog to get through. And that was the disappointing thing for me. I probably will pick up the sequel because I want to see how the world is going to expand and make sense and see how some things are explained. But I just was so disappointed that it read so slowly because I loved so much of it. I believe I rated this either a high 3.5 stars or a low 4 stars. Then we have The Darkening. I thought that the world that Sunimura creates was gorgeous. This is a debut, and the world felt so immersive and overwhelming and oppressive, which is what these characters are experiencing in this book, this storm that is gradually basically eating away at this city. And the further out you are, it's like rings, the further are you out, the lower class you are, the rulers have to take on like the great king, and their own personality gets shifted aside when that happens, and their human vessels can't last very long. These rulers have been taking that on sooner and sooner because they're having to fight so much. But there's just a way that the world expands that was just so unexpected, and how the main character is dealing with her unexpected role in all of this, because she's trying to avenge her mother, she's trying to free her father, deal with her magic, deal with these very, very complex and nuanced characters like the prince that she gets involved with, and she's the apprentice to this guy who seems really cruel at the beginning of the book. It was so immersive that I loved every minute of my read. I rated this 4.5 stars. Then we went to Dragon's Mage. I did not realize when requesting this that this author is one of those self-pub authors that just churns out work after work after work after work. This author has Dragon's Mage and Dragon Mage as titles of her works. You're putting out so much that you have such similar titles. When you churn out that much, you're not spending a lot of time honing your world building or your character development or your plain and simple craft of the sentences. This was a terrible book. I did not like it. The characters, all the same. Yana, good grief. This girl was so like extreme reactions, like she didn't know what was going on. And all the good characters were obnoxiously good and way too forgiving. They also sounded basically like they were the same ones, and all the bad characters were horrible and evil. I don't remember what I rated it, but it wasn't very high. Probably a 1.5 stars. Then we have my second nonfiction of the month, which is the young reader's version of Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad. I thought this was very well done. Now, I didn't go into it finding out any new information. This is more of a book that you work through. I can see it working really well as a discussion group, as people coming together, really examining what they believe and confronting these beliefs together and through these guided questions. There's text and there's also reflection questions. So I thought that was really well done. So I rated this 4 stars. Then we have another arc which I got that it was good. I learned a lot from it, but the format didn't work well for the ebook, and also it just felt really simplistic as well. And that was It's My Whole Life. This was actually a young adults geared biography of a Jewish girl who is a painter who ended up perishing in Auschwitz. She did this amazing autobiography that was a musical play that she painted, and the way that she tied everything together. And so interspersed throughout this biography, you have her own paintings. I enjoyed seeing this and learning about it. Just the writing seemed really simplistic, and there were problems with the electronic version of the arc. This would have been better in a physical form. Next, I'm going to talk about the one nonfiction that I read this month, and I have really conflicted feelings about this. So, as I've talked before, I am Armenian, a quarter Armenian, and I wrote my master's thesis on the New York Times coverage of the Armenian genocide. So this is something that I have studied in depth and read a lot about. I have a fairly large collection, and when I was listening to a podcast that talked about the trial of Solomon Tehlirian, who assassinated one of the leaders of the Armenian genocide when he was in exile in Germany, and I was listening to that and realizing I had swallowed the story that was put out in the trial, but actually there was a conspiracy behind it where the diaspora, the Armenian diaspora, realized, hey, these world leaders aren't doing anything about these war crimes. So there were trials of these leaders, but in absentia, because these leaders had fled and gotten refuge, most of them in Germany, and they weren't actually being tried and held accountable for their crimes. And so there was actually a conspiracy to sort of hold them accountable. In that podcast, they mentioned this book, because this is the name of the operation that was taken on by civilians, basically, to take care of this. And I'm like, okay, I gotta go get this book. I've got to read it because I want to know more about it. This book talked briefly about it, but it was way more of an overview of the history leading up to the genocide, a bit about the genocide, the history of Tehlirian's trial, and brief mentions and a chapter or two about other actions that Operation Nemesis took, which was really disappointing to me because I wanted to find out more about the title. It's Operation Nemesis, the assassination plot that avenged the Armenian genocide. There was more to Operation Nemesis than just Tehlirian's role. In that sense, it's disappointing. But for me, because the Armenian genocide is not talked about as much, I am not going to disparage a book that talks about the Armenian genocide. So that's where the confliction comes in, because Boghossian did a really good job telling the story, and the story that he told, like every piece fit for the story he told. But the story he told does not match the title, supposed aim of the book. So that's why I still rated this 4 stars. Next, I'm going to talk about the Brandon Sanderson books that I read this month. I am making my way through all of Sanderson's backlist. I keep making progress, multiple books in a month, but he has so many books that I still have a lot to go. So the first of those that I read this month, Alloy of Law. I got this for my birthday, and it was my foray into Mistborn Era 2. Now there are multiple camps that adore Mistborn Era 1, don't really like Era 2. There's not as many that prefer Era 2 to Era 1, and then there's a handful that like both of them. I think I'm going to be in that third camp. One of the reasons that people don't like Era 2 as much is because of the humor and the dynamics between Wax and Wayne. As I mentioned in reviews of previous books, I vibe with Sanderson's humor, so Wayne was one of my favorite characters. One of my favorite Sanderson characters. And I loved their dynamic throughout this book. I also loved seeing the development of the magic and the world. It just was really well done. I also loved all of the references back to Era 1. There's just something in my brain that when you have this complex world building and you make those references, you make those connections, that's the whole thing about history that I love. I think that's why I love Sanderson's writing so much. And I'm trying to think of synonyms so I don't say the same words over and over again, but 5 stars. Next we have Skyward Flight. This behemoth is actually a bind up of the 3 novellas, and it is the only one that I have the US cover of because I purchased it from Brandon Sanderson's website and as a pre-order, and it came with like a Doomslug sticker on the thing, and it's signed by both the authors. I know I didn't show it right there, but it came so close to matching Skyward for me. I loved all 3 of these and the development into FM, into Alanik, and especially Jorgen. This was just brilliant. Now I will say I read the first 2 before I read Cytonic, which I'll talk about in just a second, and then I read the last one, Evershore, which is Jorgen's story, after I read Cytonic. And I kept wanting to get back to it because the development of Jorgen is beautiful. I loved it so much because he goes through the ringer in the course of the events in this book. It's just so well done, and I loved having these chunks in the world and reading these 2 novellas before reading Cytonic, it just added depth to the story. And as I just mentioned, I love adding depth to the story. So hands down, this is so far in the 4 books that I have read of this series, this is my second favorite, and I did rate this 4.5 stars. Last of the Brandon Sandersons, we have Cytonic, and a lot of people, this is their least favorite, and I think I would also say that it's my least favorite, but not because I didn't like it. I still really liked it and appreciated the world building that you got in this. The thing that I missed is there's where Spencer goes, and I can't say anything more, she interacts with far fewer characters, beings, in this book than she does in the previous 2. A lot of people have said that this does the same thing as Starsight, and she gets a found family again. And while she meets people, they never really get to the level of found family that you get in Skyward and Starsight. There's a lot that you need to have in this book, and I feel about this similarly to how I felt about Well of Ascension when I read that. And I hope that my previous experience with Sanderson, I hope that means that when I read Defiant, the 4th book in this series, that I will look back even more fondly on Cytonic. Next we have a mixed bag of BookBox books. Got it right the first time. So I have been trying to pull more from my physical TBR when I make my TBRs for the month. And so obviously I had all these BookBox books, and I had some really, really good ones. Ones that I was both looking forward to and ones that caught me off guard, and others that just fell a little flat. And one of them I will be unhauling. I just realized I've already unhauled one of them, so there's actually 6. So I'll start with the one that I've already unhauled, and that is Book of Night by Holly Black. I had hoped, because I was hearing similar things about Book of Night and how people felt about it as I was hearing about Gallant. And when I read Gallant, I really loved it. So I hope that I would be in the minority that would still appreciate it because I love her Folk of the Year series. No, Book of Night was such a chore to read. It took me so long comparatively to get through it because it was only a 300-some page book. The characters really didn't have any depth. The story felt weird. Like the plot, it was like a manual car that someone doesn't know how to drive. And so you're constantly going forward, stalling, going forward, stalling. And then the magic system with the shadows, I thought it could get intriguing, but then it got so confusing. And there was something that she did with her sister towards the end. And then something gets revealed about that. And I'm like, wait, what happened with that? What? And I had to go back and read that section. I'm like, I didn't see that when I read that. So I'm like, did you think that you wrote that in there, but it wasn't actually in there? And then the love interest and how he's supposed to develop and we're supposed to care about him. He was such a non-entity and so stoic and unemotional in the first part of the book that I'm like, why should I care about him? So I read that one at the beach and I actually unhauled it in a little library down there because that was one of the Pokeathon prompts was to unhaul a book. So I'm like, I like this one, so I'm not going to bring it back with me. On a much better note, we have Only a Monster by Vanessa Len. So this was actually in 2 book boxes at the beginning of the year. I got what I think is the less pretty version, but I still like it. And I really enjoyed this book. I have seen reviews that were like, wait, this is just time travel. Why do they consider that monstrous? But the way that the author actually explained it in here makes sense as to why they call themselves monsters. And the main character trying to figure out her place in this world, which has been kept totally secret by that part of her family. And then combining that with the fact that she is actually mixed race. And so I don't remember the ethnicity of her father, but her mother's side of the family was British. And it was her mother's side of the family that had all the monstrousness. And so she was looked down on not just because she was mixed race, but also because she was mixed as in part monster, part not. And she's getting into this world and people are looking at her going, oh, you're an abomination. And she's having to deal with that and deaths and things getting upturned and topsy-turvy. And the way that Vanessa Len explored that in this book and the development of the so-called hero, the monster hunter, and what was done to him and how he was created, which gets resolved sort of, but not really because this is the first in a series. I'm not sure whether it's a trilogy or a duology. Really well done, and I cannot wait to pick up the sequel. I rated this, I believe, 4 stars. Next we have Hotel Magnifique. I enjoyed this. I will be keeping the book, not because it was necessarily 1000% spectacular. I enjoyed the world building. I enjoyed how the author developed the villain origin, how things worked, the relationship with the main character to magic, to the love interest. Where I felt it let down a little bit was with the development of her relationship with her sister, who I would think would be a more primary character in this book, considering how much of her motivation is for her sister. But you barely see her sister. Even when her sister is there, she's not really a character, so to speak. It's hard to say anything without giving anything away about that. I rated this 3.5 stars. Really, really good concept. Some problems and flaws with execution. Next we have the second and other one that I'm going to unhaul, and that is A Forgery of Roses. So the reading experience for this one was a little bit different for me because I set aside times for myself to read, and I was reading in the morning. It was about lunchtime, so I put the book down, got up and got lunch, and then when I came back, it felt like I came back to a different book. Not that anything was stellar and outstanding about the start of this, but I really enjoyed the premise that the author was building for this and the magic being expressed through the art and her trying to hold that back so she can provide for her family, for her sister, since her mother and father are both missing and presumed dead. But then when I came back to the book, there was this developing, budding love interest. The scene that I opened up to was so cringy. It was just so cheesy. And I'm like, wait, what book am I reading? And it was so jarring, and it was kind of like, ugh. things did not get better from there. The way that the plot ended up developing was very cliche. I think I wrote in my review that it rolled downhill into a pit of cliche. And so for that reason, I am unhauling this. The last two of the BookBox boxes were actually really, really good. So we have first the Stardust. When I read the synopsis for this, I remember being a little apprehensive that it would be too much like the Sands of Arawia. And I say that not because I hate that. Obviously, I bought special editions, but because I didn't want a repeat of it, I wanted to be able to enjoy this book. Now, they do share a fairly similar premise with a thief, with Middle Eastern mythology, but this one is way more closely tied to 1001 Nights. It does that retelling better than the Wrath and the Dawn duology. I really enjoyed this. I think this is considered adult, but I think it could be a bridge between young adult and adult. And the way that Chelsea Abdullah builds her characters and builds the interactions between the characters, it's really complex. I did get a little lost at times with the mythology, but only because I'm not as familiar with it. But eventually things started to make sense. Things started to ramp up, and just the questioning of what's right and what's not. What do I know about this thing, and is it completely wrong? Also, like the so-called cowardice of the younger son. It's like he's having, I know I didn't finish that thought, but I don't really know how to finish that thought. I really enjoyed it. I rated this 4.5 stars. The unexpected hit of these BookBox books is Portrait of a Thief. When I got this, I'm like, wait a second, this isn't a fantasy book. This is a heist book. And I thought, okay, that's still gonna give it a little bit of leeway and grace. I like the caper stuff. Grace Lee takes this concept of these characters returning art that was stolen, and it centers around these 5 zodiac heads that were part of a palace, I forget the name, that was destroyed in a war of aggression in China, and then the proceeds and the spoils were taken back to all of these different places. And the Chinese government has asked for those pieces back, but the museums and whatever are like, no, this is part of conquest. We own these now. I am way more on the side of this art belongs with the people who created that art, or whose ancestors created that art. Like, I remember going to the British Museum and seeing the Parthenon low relief sculptures and looking around at the other people. I'm like, I wonder how many of these people realized that these were stolen by Napoleon. Yeah, they were stolen by Napoleon from the Greek Parthenon, and then when the British defeated Napoleon, the British took it back. Grace Lee does this way more of literary fiction than, say, a caper novel. She actually dives into the characters of these 5 college-age students who are participating in this scheme to get back these 5 zodiac heads. And this is definitely new adult in the age range, maybe adult. I don't know what you would quantify like age group. It's definitely not young adult. It was so introspective and thought-provoking that I really enjoyed this. And this was either a high 4 stars or a 4.5 stars. Next, I'm going to talk about 2 hard copy, physical copy graphic novels that I read this month. The first of those is Orgullo y Prejuicio, which is a graphic novel version in Spanish of Pride and Prejudice. This did not do well in the adaptation. It was very wordy. The pictures were just there. They didn't tell part of the story like really good graphic novels do. Of course, I enjoyed the end. I read the end really quickly, but I love the last 20-ish% of Pride and Prejudice. It's one of my favorite stories. I didn't mind my read, but this was not really a great adaptation of it. I ended up rating it 4 stars. Pride and Prejudice overall is an all-time favorite, so 5 stars. Just the problems with the adaptations, I bumped it down. It's really hard to read classics. Then I have Mamo, which is a bind-up of 5 comics by Sass Milridge. This is the first of the comic subscription. It's out of a store in San Francisco, I believe. And I am really liking that I found this subscription because it's bringing graphic novels that I never would have known otherwise. So in here you have two characters. One, I'm forgetting the names, but her grandmother was the head witch, the specific witch for this certain town where this character lives, and she has died, but there's supposed to be this process when the witch dies where you bury her bones in this certain order and pattern, and if you don't do that, there's chaos. And so she left never intending to come back, but now there's chaos in the town and she's come back to try to figure it out. Maybe she's there reluctantly to put her grandmother's afterlife in order. And then this character is having to deal with some of the consequences from that. Something that goes wrong involves her mother. And so she seeks out this character to get her help, and they end up forming a friendship and a relationship to solve this problem. The art in here is gorgeous. I love it so much. It's so bright and vivid. I never would have known about this book except for this subscription, and this is one of my favorites of the month. This segment, I'm going to talk about the last two physical books that I read for the month. First off, we have The Kingdom Back by Marie Lu. Marie Lu is almost an autobi author for me. I really enjoyed the Champion series. I have loved the books from the Young Elites that I've read. I've also enjoyed several others of hers that I can't remember the names of the series right now. And this one really appealed to me because it combines history, music, and fantasy. And the main character in this is Mozart's sister, and a real person who existed. And she takes the idea of the Kingdom of Back, which was mentioned briefly in a biography of Mozart that was done after his death, where his sister Nannerl talks about it. But Marie Lu takes this and sort of expands on it in a very interesting way. This read, I couldn't keep myself from coming back to this. She was born in an era where women who had these sort of skills with music that she did, like you could do it when you were a kid, but as soon as you got to marrying age, you needed to stop doing that. Of course, it didn't help that her brother was such a prodigious talent as well. And so it was socially acceptable for him to do all of these things, but not her. But they had a really close relationship, at least from everything that the records show. So this is a really interesting exploration of that. The one drawback for me was how she would talk about how time was progressing, but her own age in her narration and like the way she sounded never really felt like she was going from 11 to almost 17. She still read very young towards the end of the book. I really enjoyed it. This was a solid 4 stars for me. The last physical book that I read in this month was Shadow and Bone. I have read the Grishaverse completely out of order. I read Six of Crows, then I read the King of Scars, Rule of Wolves duology, and then I read Crooked Kingdom. Now I'm finally reading the original Grisha trilogy. Partially, I guess, for that reason, because I knew so much going in. There's certain parts of this that I already knew, and certain ways that things turned out that I already knew. I think that helped me read it fast, but I got to a point where I put it down for lunch and I'm like, wait, I'm like 260 some pages through this book and I haven't been reading for that long. And this book just read so compulsively quickly, and I just kept making my way through the book. I enjoyed it. Wasn't a lot of depth, but it's almost like I didn't want the depth. When I got to that point, I'm like, how am I going to review this? Because it's read so quickly that like, and I don't even know why it's read so quickly for me, but I enjoyed it. And so I will be purchasing the other 2 books in the trilogy. So 4 stars. Okay, so this last clip is going to be a little bit different because I read more books in the month of July than I read in the first 3 months of the year. I don't know how I managed it. Just was consuming so much that it got to the point where I was having a hard time thinking about how to review these books, as I mentioned in my August TBR. So what I'm going to do in this last little clip is I'm going to run through the 18 books that I have read since the last little clip and give a brief 1-sentence maybe 2-sentence synopsis of the book and how I felt about it. First off, we have Felix Silver, Something and Teaspoons. I can't even remember the actual title. This was terrible. So full of cliches, did not like it. Then we had Cosplay, a very short graphic novel comic about a kid who loves to cosplay and ends up saving his country. Then I read both Sheets and Delicates, and I loved them. They are set in the late 90s about a girl who's lost her mother. Family runs a laundromat, and this boy who died, he can come back as a ghost, and he's covered with a sheet. It's adorable, really well done. Then we have The Black Girls Left Standing. I thought it was well done. It's hard hitting because the main character's sister is shot by an off-duty cop who doesn't get justice. Well, they don't get justice for her. I just did not connect with the main character. It's well written. I just have read a lot of books similar to this lately. Then we have A Darker Shade of Magic. I picked this up thinking I was going to read it as part of a Pokeathon read. Really enjoyed it and am really excited to get into this series going forward. I do enjoy V.E. Schwab's writing. Next we have The Battle of Cable Street, a children's fiction, yet explaining a real-life historical event that I didn't know anything about. Deals with the rise of fascism in Great Britain, and a lot of people don't realize or acknowledge that it happened. Then we have The Name She Gave Me, which is a book written in verse about an adoptee who is dealing with wanting to connect with her roots and a mother who has her own issues. Hard-hitting, well-written. Then we have one of my standouts of this group of 18. That is Goth Girl, Queen of the Universe. I thought it dealt with mental illness representation, all sorts of other representation really well. I will link my story graph in the description for a more detailed description of this. Then we have I Rise, which at this point, I know I enjoyed more than Black Girl Standing, but I cannot remember the synopsis. Then we have Prince of Sea and Song, which is the tale of the Little Mermaid, only told from Eric's perspective. They added in something to the story that I thought was good, but it's still just a Little Mermaid retelling. Then we have one that's disappointing for me, and that is The Pennymoors and the Curse of the Invisible Quill. This just felt so dense, so difficult to read. Unfortunately, I did not enjoy it. This was one that I got a physical copy of the book after requesting it on NetGalley. Then I have How We Ricochet, which deals with the trauma of a shooting event where the people involved weren't injured, but they were affected. One of them has massive PTSD. I didn't really engage with the characters, but a lot of the stuff talked about in there, it was discussed well. And we have We Are All We Have. I wanted to enjoy this book. I wanted to appreciate this book, but the main character who is dealing with immigration issues because they are asylum seekers, and this is set in 2019, but she made such unreasonable choices that I just could not empathize with her, or I could not make sense of the choices that she was making, and there was just so much mystery and back and forth with her family. I wanted to like it more than I did. Then we have A Year to the Day, where the main character is dealing with the death of her sister who died in a tragic car accident, and it's told in a backwards time setting format, hard to describe. I don't usually like that, but Robin Benway did such a brilliant job that the reveal in the second to last chapter took my breath away. Then we have The White House Plumbers, which is a short non-fiction account of one of the men who was involved in the initial break-in that inspired the Watergate break-in, and it was a really interesting look at the situation. It wasn't new information, but it told a different side of it. And then finally, we had Wind Daughter, which is the sequel to Echo North, which I read earlier. And there's just something about Joanna Ruth Meyer's writing that just sucks me in, keeps me captivated, leaves me without words and a book hangover. when I finish. That was a brilliant way to end my July. So I have this stack here that you can see, and I have no idea how I'm going to lift this up. I'm probably going to divide it in half, but like this is only basically half of the books that I've read this month. So let's see if I can get it held up so I can maybe get a thumbnail taken. Things are falling.